This is Jason Kingsley, historian, host of Modern History TV, and CEO of the video game studio Rebellion. Today he's joining us to share his thoughts on the epic early access RTS medieval city builder, Manor Lords.
I can vouch for the fact that the more work you do with animals, the stronger you get. You don't need to go to the gym at all. You just shoveling shit literally gets you fit.
Jason does plenty of deep dives into medieval life over on his own channel. Links to that and all of his socials are in the description below. Hey everyone, before we get into the video, we want to deliver a quick message about Red Nose Day. Red Nose Day believes less childhood poverty means more childhood. When kids have all the support they need, they are more free to be their best selves. Donations give kids facing poverty access to more nutritious food, safety, quality education, and so much more. If you believe that every kid should have the opportunity to chase a brighter future, donate today at rednoseday.org. Right, over to Jason.
Now, one of the interesting things is at this period in the medieval history, there weren't that many areas of sort of wilderness as such. There were lots of places were already settled. So starting in the middle of nowhere, sort of a bit like the winning of the West, for example, didn't really happen in quite the same way. You had waves of migrants coming over. Chances are you'd be setting up a settlement at crossroads or where there's plenty of water. Now, burgage plots, absolutely. This is a big thing. One of the key things about burgage plots is they reflect the needs of a medieval household. So a medieval household needed a place to sleep, but also needed a place to keep pigs, because pretty much every household had domestic pigs. But they also needed to grow their own food as well. So they effectively were living on allotments. In the UK, we have things called allotments, which you can get from the local government, which is a chunk of land you can grow your veggies on, your potatoes and leeks and whatever it might be, broad beans. So burgage plots are long and narrow and often go onto a back lane, and you still see that in some English town plans. And yeah, we're collecting big logs here. A lot of medieval houses are built with whatever material is available. So ideally you want nice big logs of oak, but if you can't get that, you use whatever wood you can get hold of. And you notice they're using oxen here, and I'll pause it again because oxen are very interesting. A lot of people don't actually know what oxen are. Well, oxen are male cows who have been castrated. In the medieval period, if you had a male cow, a bull becomes very dangerous when it matures and it's very strong. But if you neuter it, if you geld it, which you would do with a horse, for example, you create a very physically strong but much more docile creature. Think of them as like tractors to an ordinary car. So let's think of a horse as a car and an oxen as a tractor. They go slowly, they're very docile, but they get the job done. A lot of medieval buildings don't have particularly deep foundations. They're often just built into holes in the ground, and the earth gets trodden in. And thatch is a big thing as well. You notice the angle of the roof. Thatch, it just redirects the drips of the rain. So it drips on the bit below it and trundles down and drips on the bit below it. So you need a decent thickness of thatch, and it's straw or reeds that were gathered and put at a very strong angle. So you had very steep roofs. And of course, there's a natural problem with dry thatch and fire. There's a lot of buildings burnt down in the medieval period. There's a main road here, and the main roads would typically go from a place to another place. They connected interesting trade routes often. They connected interesting towns that might have a market. The concept of a market was very important in the medieval period. You had to have a license to have a market. The king and the lord of the manor got money for having a market. The other big power group in the medieval period, and this is sort of 13th, 14th century we're talking about here by the looks of the clothing, was the church. Of course, the church took 10% of your income, and the church served as a social centre, welfare as well. They supposedly looked after your spiritual and physical health as well. Most churches were probably little more than big huts until the village had enough money to make a big one like this, with a spire. Spires tend to come in quite a lot later in the medieval churches are literally just huts. I'm going to pause it again here. In real life, you set up your structure where you've got your natural resources. Key things are shelter, water, food. So you don't want to be walking for miles and miles to get your water. You want to be near a good water source. That might be a stream or a river. It can't be bad water because you just won't survive there. And often marshes and places like that have a lot of infectious beasts. So mosquitoes and midges and things, and they're bad. So you try to set up away from that kind of stagnant water. But you also need land. And typically a medieval village would have 3 great fields because they farmed communally. Or rather, the fields were shared communally and were allocated by lots. So you might have a strip on that land, on the big field. And one of those great fields would be kept barren for 1 year. So there'd be a constant cycling of fertility. That was the idea. You put your animals on the big field that's not being used for anything. They poo everywhere, tread their dung in. You then plough it up and plant your food on it the next year. So let's watch what this game does. It's absolutely right. You set up where the fertility is the highest. Ploughing by hand is fairly unlikely unless you've got no alternative. It's extremely hard work. Ploughing by hand is more for digging for your turnips. Obviously no potatoes back then. They were in the Americas, but your turnips, your root vegetables and that kind of stuff. But you'd probably be using an ox and a heavy plough. And that ox is going quite fast there. I would say he's probably going twice as fast. And turning around is an interesting one. If we pause here, modern ploughs can flip, so they all plough the same way. You go one way down the field, you get to the end, pull the plough up, rotate the plough, drive back down, and it ploughs the opposite way. But from the field's perspective, it's all going left to right or right to left. Medieval ploughs were little more than boards that were breaking up the soil. It didn't really tip it one way or the other. What that means is you end up with wavy lines in fields. You look at aerial photographs, you can see the line isn't straight. The line wobbles in a very lazy S. Men and women worked equally, and we have a lot of pictures of people working stripped down to more or less their underwear. They've rolled down their leggings, they've taken their hoods off, they've taken their shirts off. Women, obviously, there's no illustrations of women doing that, but a lot of men in little more than their linen underwear digging in the sunlight. Wheat and barley were very important. Barley in particular was very important. Flax, obviously, is what you can grow the fibres for linen. You can have the seed to make oil from, which is quite useful for all sorts of things. Linseed oil. The fibres can be retted and allowed to, they produce a fibre, which is what linen is all about. Crop harvesting was very manual. Men, women and children got involved in this, and it's probably a big celebration as well. There's nothing more satisfying than getting your harvest in, because that ensures you're going to survive over the winter. And let's not forget that food wasn't readily available. You couldn't just sort of jump online and order food. If you didn't have a good harvest, you knew you were going to have a really miserable winter. Now, foraging is interesting. Foraging is obviously something people did, but there were rites associated with it. For example, you could turn your pigs out to what's pannage, to forage for acorns. Of course, human beings can eat acorns if they have to. It's really not very nice. I've tried it. Berries, yes, I don't think they were a big part of people's diet back then. Obviously, from a game's perspective, it's an easy wild food to harvest. Yeah, and there's an interesting one. So herb gardens were definitely a thing. Herbs are really important. They added spice. So things like mint and thyme were grown, they were particularly grown in monasteries and things like that, but they were also grown for medicinal as well as culinary purposes. It's likely they ate quite a lot, because you can't do physical work and stay alive without eating quite a lot of calories. You're going to be doing a lot of walking. You're going to be doing a lot of lifting and shoveling. I can vouch for the fact that the more work you do with animals, the stronger you get. You don't need to go to the gym at all. You just shoveling shit literally gets you fit. Now, it's interesting in the game, they've used a lot of sloping land, and I think that's fine. It makes it variable, but we often see most medieval villages set up on flat land. You know, building into the land means you've got to physically dig quite a lot of soil out. You've got an awkwardness. You've got damp coming in as well. You don't want that. You know, there's no central heating. You've got a central hearth, but you don't really want moisture coming into your building if you can possibly avoid it. Often the fence around your burgage plot, your garden, would be more of those horizontal, like wattle and daub, same stuff your walls are made out of. So it's woven, usually woven hazel in and out. So not picket fence like this. Now these houses look quite big, actually. These are level 1 houses. They're fairly substantial. So these are wealthy medieval people, relatively speaking. A lot of people lived in sheds, really. I mean, just have a look at how it works in the third world sometimes. A roof over your head is a luxury, and that's great. You don't need big spaces. You don't need upper chambers. You don't need them. You want them, probably. These are more like townhouses. Some of these are 3-story properties. And I would suggest those would have been more likely to not get in a village, but more likely to be seen in the developing towns and marketplaces. Hunting was a big thing, typically reserved for the nobility, though. You would get into a lot of trouble if you took the king's deer, as we know from stories of Robin Hood. It happened. Poaching happened then, it happens now. But you would keep it quiet. Here we can see a medieval person, bright colours, great. Love to see bright colours on medieval people because they loved their colours. Those hoods, I've got several of those shaped hoods, and they're incredibly warm. They keep you warm. Wool and another layer of wool is fantastic, and is exactly what they wore. So the very accurate costumes here, which is wonderful. Now I have some thoughts about dragging a whole carcass like that. You'd probably put it on a horse. You probably wouldn't be carrying the body of a stag like that back easily. You'd probably butcher it on site. You certainly gut it on site, might skin it on site and take back your selected remains, because you can hide it. Because if you're going to get into trouble for poaching, the last thing you want is a big display like that. Depending on the era, you might lose a hand or have an eye put out for doing this. So this is a high risk activity, but it happened, obviously. There's a handcart. I've got a handcart. They're brilliant. They're really fun. They make a brilliant noise. It makes a really nice sound as you're trundling along. It doesn't skid like that, though. You have to turn it on its centre. That's been done because of the requirements of the animation and the requirements of the game. And I'm fully familiar. For those that don't know, I make games for a living, so I know the limitations of what you can and can't do with animation in a game, and what happens in real life.
If we just pause a sec, if we can. So the game allows you to set up hunting limits when these sanctioned hunters go out and hunt deer. Otherwise, you will just kill off all of your deer, and then the next year those hunters will have no work to do and you'll be short a source of meat. How would medieval people know right, we need to stop hunting now? I'm guessing it's something that happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there were foresters. There was a profession. There was a profession called forester, and their job was to manage the landscape. They were sort of wildlife police in a way. I mean, they were designed to preserve the hunting facilities, really, for the Lord of the Manor. So there were plenty of places where wildlife gets hunted to more or less to extinction. Could the tragedy of the commons. If everybody gets some now, great, they have some food now, but then it's all gone.
The game has rendered the liquid as a very suspect yellowy colour as well.
Well, tanning was a very stinky job. It was literally involved shit. You would make a slurry of urine, feces, human urine and feces sometimes, dog muck as well, called pure. And in a lot of the towns, they sent the children out first thing in the morning. So parents, just remind your children that if they'd lived a long time ago, they'd have been sent out to collect dog muck off the streets before breakfast.
I don't believe the mechanic has been implemented yet, because obviously the game's early access, but when you look on the overlay, there's one for smell. So I'm anticipating the tanners are going to stink pretty bad, and it'll make your neighbours and the people living by pretty unhappy.
A lot of things in the medieval period smelled quite badly, and you'd put really smelly things like that downwind. And we have city ordinances which the tanning industry needs to be downstream and downwind from you. Ale or beer was hugely important. Think of it as a liquid bread. Pretty much everybody drank beer from an early age to when they died, and I think it contributed quite a lot of the calories to the diet. So it was sought after as a result of that. And having a little bit of a buzz at lunchtime just kind of makes going out digging in the fields again a bit easier, perhaps. I don't know. Now, this looks a bit fantasy to me. This is a little bit not how it would be. You wouldn't really have a tavern as such in the same way. In a village like this, you'd have somebody who was good at brewing beer, and they put a broom outside their house to say, I've got a brew on, does anybody want some? And you go in and take your mug and drink with your friends. It didn't keep though, so you needed to get the ale drunk quickly. So I can imagine a few people going, it's a bit more than we can drink, let's just have a party. So whether you'd have as good equipment as this with shields or not, it would depend on who was supplying you with the weapons. You might just turn up with the weapons you had to hand. It might just be a sickle, a scythe, or your knife. You might then end up strapping your knife onto a pole you could get hold of, or taking your hedging tool, turning it into a bill with a long handle. Chances of the militia in the early medieval period having swords are unlikely. Spears are ubiquitous from ancient times all the way through to the modern era. If you think about what a bayonet is a spear point attached to your gun. It's a spear, not a very good spear. A useful spear, not as good as a real spear. You often had to do 30 days of military service. It was fairly strictly adhered to, so the nobility had to keep an eye on how long you were fighting for, because after 30 days, off you go, back home. And they didn't want to fight during harvest either if they could avoid it, because they needed everybody on the land to gather the food in for the winter.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because while playing the game, it was actually apparent that if my militia were away from the town for too long and over certain seasons, I made the mistake of campaigning in September, my farms were, they weren't being harvested as quickly, and my food reserves were then lower in the winter. So it's interesting that war and battle was planned out historically to support the agriculture and the economy as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, manpower, man, woman, child power was hugely important. You know, if you couldn't take your harvest in, well, guess what? It rots in the fields. Now, a bad harvest would cause you problems. You would know you'd had a bad harvest. You might have a harvest that's bad enough for you to not have any surplus, which means you're not going to starve. And if you wanted to go on campaign during harvest time, I think you'd find a lot of people saying, not going to do that. Because if I go on campaign during the harvest time, my children will starve to death, and I ain't doing that. It doesn't matter what you do to me. Yeah, people were paid wages, you know, so you'd have professional soldiers. In some cases, they had to provide for themselves, but a lot of cases, there were professional soldiers. You paid a certain number of pennies a day, depending on what you brought. So sometimes we have notifications of people bringing better weapons, and they get paid an extra penny a day. And people have certain skills. You know, there might be archers, master archers, and they get paid 3 pence a day. They might bring a horse. There might be a knight. They might get paid a shilling a day. So you know, there was a hierarchy of pay depending on how efficient you are. Mercenaries were very often very well armed and armoured because that was their job. And one thing you'll notice here is everybody's got helmets on. That's the first piece of armour you would want to get in combat. And they've got the nice pointy helmets as well, which are meant to deflect swords, and they do deflect swords. I've got a cheap helmet I use as a target for my swords, and if you don't get right on the dome, the sword just flies off, which is why probably if somebody's got a helmet on like that, you don't hit them with a sword or spear, you hit them with a mace, something heavy, try and get the impact to go through and break their neck. Combat's always an interesting one. How does combat in the real world actually work? And obviously it has to be stylized and potentially sanitized for our entertainment purposes. Anybody that's been in real combat, whatever it might be, modern military, knows how blimmin' horrible it is. Medieval combat was potentially as bad, if not worse. You had to be close to people, generally speaking. Especially if you're going to stab them with a sword, you can hear what they're saying. If you understand what they're saying, they might be saying, you know, F off. You know, there's lots of swearing going on. Lots of people not wanting to close in on a formed army like this. I mean, would you charge in to 150 men standing there with swords and weapons? It's like, it takes quite a lot of courage to do that, and you're probably going to die. Lots of stabbing. Definitely lots of stabbing. Stabbing with a spear is relatively quick and easy, and that direct stab to get somebody to go away, because that's what you're probably trying to do, just go away, don't kill me. Got a lot of close quarter combat here. I think a man in armour against men not in armour. Man in armour is very difficult to kill. They've got full armour like this. Some of these are very well armoured. They've got full face protection, head protection, upper bodies. They've got shields. They've got axes. Got some interesting type of axes there for that period. It's likely to be different weapons than axes. But you've got the right kind of numbers. Interestingly, a lot of the ancient combat, the ancient world, Persians and the Romans and, the Chinese, had tens of thousands of soldiers in their armies. In the medieval period, you get armies of 150, which is little, I've got 600 people work at Rebellion. That's 2 medieval armies worth. So it's kind of interesting that the scale and the scope on these islands, which is so sort of fun in a way, is vanishingly small compared to the ancient Egyptians or the ancient Romans. The scale of warfare radically decreased and changed. But the weaponry becomes very different, and steel plate armour becomes very efficient. So as noble household grow, you get your retinue, you get your household guards. As you have more money, you can have people whose job it is to sort of be your bodyguards, to be your household. A lot of places they had a lord, 2 men-at-arms and 2 longbowmen. We're not talking hundreds. You have to go to the higher levels of nobility to have people with retinues of 150. It's expensive to arm a man-at-arms in the latest equipment. You're talking about the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of kit per person. Just think of the military today, what they get given, how much a rifle costs and how much body armour costs and how much a tank costs. Imagine doing that out of your private income and how many people even a rich person could afford to have in their army.
You mentioned helmets and different equipment. Yeah, you can increase the survivability of your militia by equipping them with things like gambesons and helmets, but you have to make them. And if there's not enough to go around, then your militia will turn up. As I experienced in my game, half of them aren't wearing armour. They've come out in their woolen hoods and just their normal shirts, standing next to some luckier chap who's got a gambeson and a plate helmet.
I think that's extremely likely. You can only equip the people you've got equipment for. If you've got warning you're going to combat in 3 months' time. Maybe you can get some stuff made. But if you get very little warning, it's like you've got to assemble your men in a week. I like the idea here. You've got brightly coloured banners as well. Banners are really useful on the battlefield. It's very easy to get disorientated. We've probably all gone for walks in woods and couldn't work out where we are, whether we're going north, south, east or west. The same chaotic thing happens on the battlefield. Which way am I facing? You could get turned around in combat and be facing completely the wrong way. And if you could see the banners, this is our colour, you can regroup to that colour. And so those banners are above everybody's head height. They're flapping in the wind. They're brightly coloured. It's like, I'm going to go back to the dragon banner because that's my side. That's what they're for. They have secondary uses of morale and rallying points and that kind of stuff, but they basically help orientate you on the battlefield. Now, some of these troops are very well organised. They're all coordinated. They're all in a nice line there. Obviously, that's gameplay. It's the way the AI is going, and it goes a bit more chaotic now. I think people, unless they're on the parade ground, are not that coordinated. There's sort of be a bit more of a lump, with maybe a front line that's coordinated and then a lump of people behind them. It's hard enough. I've ridden at the Battle of Hastings in the conroys there with the horses, sort of 10 horses side by side. Trying to keep 10 horses in a line, more or less coordinated, without anybody actually trying to kill you is quite difficult. Trying to keep 100 horses in line or 1,000 men in line is going to be even more difficult. So I have a suspicion there's much more chaos on the medieval battlefield than we like to think. I think it's really interesting to see a game that's so focused on the reality of the medieval period. We have lots of ideas that come from the media typically about what the medieval is like. Movies like Game of Thrones, which is kind of quasi-medieval, or games like Dungeons and Dragons, which is sort of semi-medieval-y with lots of overlaps. But the real medieval, which is this, which I'm very pleased they've done a great job on it. I got told that people had used some of my work on Modern History TV, which is my YouTube channel, as a reference point, which is great, which is what it's there for. I try to dig into the realities of the medieval period, what it was really like to be a medieval peasant. I love seeing these things from the perspective of a sort of a medieval enthusiast and a practical horseman, for example. I ride my own horses, so I know how horse handling works. But I also can see what they're doing from a gameplay perspective, from the technology and the gameplay. It's really nice to see, and I think they've done a great job. It's fantastic to see a game of this quality doing so well. So well done, the team that did it.
A big thanks to Jason for joining us on this video, and thank you so much for watching. Remember to comment below what other games you'd like to see on the show, and be sure to subscribe for more content like this and beyond.